Communication rights, elusive but essential. I'm Minna Aslama-Horowitz from the University of Helsinki, and I am delighted to be your guest lecturer this week. I believe this topic is extremely important. It's probably something that you have been already thinking about and talking about quite a bit. It is also one of the most debated at the moment, whether in academic or activist advocacy circles. So I hope you're going to enjoy this little dive into the different discourses and debates around communication rights. What we're going to do is first talk a little bit about a brief history of communication rights and why the rights debate is in the rise and trending, if you like, right now. And then I'm going to give you one model, just suggest one model through which you can assess communication rights, whether you're an activist, advocate, or a scholar. A very simple model that gives you one tool to grasp this complex issue. So let's go and take a look. Rights. The whole rights conversation really, in this global sense, started, of course, with the United Nations in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it already included a point about communication, famously Article 19 about freedom of expression, freedom of speech. There's also a civil society organization called Article 19 to honor that. And freedom of expression is in many constitutions as well. So in a sense, it is an idea of our modern times, very much so. But when communication rights really became a sort of a contested issue and very much debated about was after that, and up until sort of 70s, even 80s, when amongst UN circles, countries that had recently become independent, many countries from the global south, were kind of experiencing sort of becoming to the sphere of mass communication. Many of them did not have as robust media systems as many countries in the global north. And there was the issue that I think we all have experienced, sort of the flow from the West to the rest, especially the so-called American cultural imperialism. So amongst the UN circles, there was very much a conversation about right to communication and right to communicate. Right to communicate became a slogan or kind of the concept that the UN was evoking those times, and really opening up the idea that national media systems are important in preserving and disseminating information, education, and culture, and media and communication cannot just be an import. It's important for nation states in nation building and so on and so forth. Then the relatively quickly moved from sort of new world communication order conversations, which entailed what I just told, to the world of the internet, which seemed to change everything. All of a sudden, there was a lot of more democratic playing field to be claimed, if you like. And although when this conversation started in the late 1990s and really came to fruition around the turn of the millennium, of course the whole world wasn't connected. It still is not. As we know, only 60% of the world are online. But at that point, there was this enthusiasm about what the internet might do in the future. And the UN organized for the first time summits, world summits on the information society, WSIS, couple of summits where nation states and their representatives, of course, international organizations, companies, as well as the civil society, were present to talk about how do we democratize the world with internet? What can we do? How can it help in global development? And then, not so soon thereafter, it became very clear that it wasn't all song and roses. It wasn't all wonderful opportunities and cause of optimism. And we started to see something else, and that needed governance. And the UN started the so-called Internet Governance Forum, which still meets once a year, is a multi-stakeholder event, but it is criticized a little bit, that it's more of a, I don't know, showroom for the fact that the UN cares about the internet, rather than a body that really helps us to understand what we can decide upon globally about our communication ecosystems that exist right now. So we start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we call WSIS IGF. Those are the sort of global institutional developments around communication rights. But really, the conversation about communication rights have become prominent because of the rise of the intermediaries, not because of the UN, but because of digital intermediaries, that is Facebook, Twitter, Google, Apple, Amazon, and so on and so forth, especially the American-based global powerhouses. And it's interesting that around the UN conversations, they were kind of like nation state led. And remember, I said early on, the question was about how nation states are built in the help of communication and media, mass media. And then all of a sudden, the rights conversation started to shift to individuals. There was a moment around 2010, and I believe it was 2011, when one of the first really critical texts was published by Evgeny Morozov. I think he's originally from Belarus, who started to warn us and started to say that, hey, the very same tools, the very same digital intermediaries that gave us the Occupy movement or the Arab Spring, those very same platforms are also used by governments and leaders who are not perhaps so democratic. And he really warned us about sort of he called it the net delusion, the sort of the dark side of the internet from that perspective. But then we started to see another dark side, and that was really how the business practices of these digital intermediaries work. I guess one of the big eye-opener was the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But as you may know very well, Cambridge Analytica had been testing the whole model of the US election, how would I put it? Maybe not interference, but something like that. They had tested that in several nations in the global south. And so all of a sudden you start to get this business model of, for instance, social networks combined with with purposes that are not democratic. And you started to see that what really drives this is the business principle. And it's no wonder that around also 2011, the UN, for instance, set up a guidelines for business practices and human rights. How different businesses can and should take human rights into account. And of course, these platforms being businesses, this is now a framework that is often used when talking about how these digital intermediaries are interfering our rights or not respecting our rights. But as you can see, many uses of rights and rights talk. And what I often say is it's good to remember, although, you know, a couple of years feels like an eternity in our digital era, but still nothing is ahistorical. So all of these still linger on and emerge and kind of coincide in different ways. So the discourses are many. Sometimes they are in alignment, sometimes they clash. Elusive concept, that communication rights. One example of the very recent approach is this, Ranking Digital Rights org. It's a non-profit, it's a foundation in Europe, it's a non-profit in the US, it's looking to establish also elsewhere. Started a couple of years ago, with some universities helping with the methodology, but it's basically a watchdog organization. And it says, these internet intermediaries are really in between us and our rights that our governments have given us, our human rights. But our governments are not very great on monitoring these rights, especially online on the internet. So how about the tech companies? Can we make them help us to realize and protect our human rights? Well, it's a very optimist thought. So this is what they did. As a watchdog organization, they started to rank countries all around the world. As you see, there's also an Indian telecom right there. And what they do is they have many indexes or indices, but they rank these 3 factors, basically. Governance, so how do human rights factor into the governance within the organization? How do they respect freedom of expression? And how do they respect and protect privacy? So, very simple example, if a government asks Telefonica, hey, we want to know what Nina Horowitz's smartphone calls are or texts are about, if I use Telefonica, let us know. Will Telefonica give that information to the government? And in which cases possibly, maybe if I'm a criminal, how does that work? Do I get notified about that? Those kind of things. And then freedom of expression, well, that feels like, hey, well, you can say anything you want, let's say, with telecom companies and so on and so forth. But think about, I love this example. Think about, for instance, Apple. Do we know which apps are deleted or not allowed to be published on Apple Store? We have no idea. And already that is impeding in freedom of expression. So if you can't freely sell your app on Apple Store, what are the rules and regulations by Apple? They are internal. Why don't we know about them? So what is slightly difficult about the ranking digital rights? And this is always so hard to explain when I use the organization as an example for my students, is that all the information they are ranking is what the companies disclose in their public websites, in their annual reports, in their briefs, whatnot. That's it. We don't actually know what they do. And ranking digital rights doesn't actually know what they really do. This is what they tell us they do. So by monitoring that, ranking digital rights tries to influence these big digital intermediaries to do better. We can imagine whether that's very successful or not. And the same thing is happening here. I was at the IGF in Berlin a little bit before COVID started, and it became very clear to me concretely in that conference, that happening, how many different views we really have about communication rights. A lot of people talk about data, and this call to our call to own our digital future is very much about our data. How can we reclaim our data? How can we reclaim our existence and our rights in that sense? But there was also a conversation about communication rights and inclusion. How do we make sure that all different kinds of groups are included? And for instance, sort of feminist perspectives to communication rights is a big thing. And then there was one other manifesto apart from this that was published that had a lot to do with how civil society and nation states should collaborate with corporations, because without corporations, we don't have this digital sphere. They really are the drivers of it. So very different kinds of approaches. And then, of course, a couple of months thereafter, we have this. And this highlighted yet something else that has highlighted the importance of the conversations around communication rights. And that is, of course, the COVID crisis, the pandemic that the WHO calls the infodemic. This crisis really highlighted how broken our information landscapes are. And different civil society groups, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, were extremely alarmed how much repression of journalists there was, how much disinformation was spread around, and I would say malinformation. So malinformation, which is purposely targeted wrong information. But then, of course, we had a lot of disinformation as well, which is sometimes perhaps not purposeful, but still completely false, such as all kinds of conspiracy theories and hoaxes. And we know how many very real consequences that had. And then one aspect of this, of course, is also the sort of incredible infection shaming, which is less often talked about, but that kind of horrible burden, online harassment and trolling and whatnot, people who got infected in some countries, and so on and so forth. A very challenging situation, which really showed us how broken our system is. To be fair, we knew beforehand that we've never been in this kind of situation in the recent modern times of mediated communication, where the trust in the media is this low all around the world. And we also know that with the pandemic, while there was tons of misinformation, but there was also a spike in trust in legacy media. But the other thing is, how long does that last? Legacy media, so quality journalism, really had a tough time because information kept changing. One day WHO says this, the other day the national government says that, so on and so forth. But it has created a hugely chaotic situation. And just as a side note, I'm going to tell you that I'm recording this video the day after Donald Trump left hospital and returned to the White House, took off the mask and gave commentary about this COVID situation that actually, I believe, Twitter flagged and Facebook removed from social media because it conflicted with scientists and health experts information. Just saying. So, just to recap, the discourses are vast. And conceptually, we can think about communication rights. Are they part of human rights? As I said, Article 19, for sure. One could say that also the issue of privacy is already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, although, you know, digital media didn't exist then, but I mean, it's still there. Privacy is still there, as well as, for instance, copyrights, because UDHR talks about a right to your intellectual and artistic achievements. Then there are a couple of challenges. From the start, the Universal Declaration has evoked a lot of conversation. Is it really universal, or how much are some of these rights relative to culture, for instance? And then from whose perspective to start with, where this declaration created, that it was such a Western look at human rights, and such a also kind of individualistic look at human rights. Then people talk about digital rights. What does that mean in this day and age? I mentioned the data rights that people are talking about. Some people are highlighting how much digitalization has changed our work. So, and that kind of becomes an issue of new kinds of labor laws even. Then some people talk about the digital rights of non-humans. What are the rights of freedom of expression of bots or AI? So on and so forth, the humongous field. And there's even talk about, when we talk about communication rights in this digital media landscape, of epistemic rights. This is something that is in particular highlighted by Shoshana Zuboff, Harvard professor emerita. And I will be sharing this book with you, Human Rights in the Age of Platforms. She has written a first chapter, so I'm urging you to read that first chapter in connection to this lecture. So, and this is an open access book for you. But just as a reminder, the Nobel Prize winner, Sen, has talked about rights as capabilities. Rights really are not, in and of itself, important, but they really have to do with our capabilities as individuals, but also as citizens in a society. How can we participate? How can we contribute? How can we create a life for ourselves? That's why we have these rights, and they are really. We can have principles, but these rights are really negotiated and realized in conversation with others. And I think this is an important underlying understanding of these rights. They alone stating these rights is meaningless, and unless we really talk about them, decide about them, and decide how to implement them. Here is Shoshana Zuboff once more. I just wanted you to see this slide because I think it's wonderful. She recently gave a speech that I will also share with you as an extra. And she kind of comes back to that. She reminds us that we are not users in this digital media ecosystem. We are really democratic citizens, and she says we are living in intolerable conditions because our rights have been taken from us, because every movement that I do online, on social media, on search engines, now there's a lot of analysis of also emotions, and so on and so forth, not only my consumption habits of news or something else, or content in general. So what she's saying is that we really need epistemic rights. And what she's saying, and I think for you, studying activism, advocacy, and policy, she talks about new legal frameworks, new charters of rights that really understand this holistic situation, different regulatory paradigms, and new institutional forms for those organizations that allows us to communicate today. Okay, but if we talk about communication rights, pardon my dog, if we talk about communication rights, still, if Shoshana Zuboff says that we need to call them epistemic rights, we need to have some tools in order to dissect what might that mean if we start to create these new charters, if we start to create new regulation, if we need new institutions. So what does that mean? She's very, very good at pointing out the pathology of our times, but what can we do? So in the research group where I'm working at the University of Helsinki, we have created a very simple, but I would claim a very effective and actually pragmatic model through which you, even as an activist or an advocate or policymaker, can start to think how to, first of all, assess and then promote rights. And we've taken 4 very basic principles that have to do with basic declarations of human rights, but so basic that they are really applicable to different contexts and applicable to that what Sen called sort of negotiating their content. We claim that these might be even universal type of rights for different contexts, and we've tested that also. And so there's access, not only technology, but also all kinds of means of communication. Then there's availability, and not only relevant contents, but also diversity of voices and opinions, and that they are readily available. Dialogical rights. And then many people say, hey, why not participation? Why do you say this complicated dialogical rights? Well, participation can be so many things. You can participate just by listening, just by being present, but you don't have the right to say something. You can participate without being heard. So dialogical rights means that if you want to contribute, you will be heard. And if you're asking a question, you will be answered. So that there is really an sort of interactive element. Dialogue also indicates that in our model that you can participate from the perspective of your own standing, with your own knowledge, your own experiences. You don't have to be an expert to participate. So that's why dialogical rights. And then privacy. Obviously, privacy is now more important than it used to be in the mass media era. Then it was really about celebrities, public figures, more than private citizens, of course, then them also sometimes. But now it really deals with us all and our privacy in platforms. And if we agree that these four could be a good way to look at what communication rights should be, then we can say, how are these being realized in any context? And we've started with the idea that in many countries, the national systems and regulatory frameworks still operate. We don't have a global legal system to govern those internet platforms. But we can also, of course, look at these four levels regionally, if there are regional bodies, or even globally, if we would sort of take an overall mapping of how different countries tend to address these different things. But we can take it to the very specific level of a nation state. So you can see how in a country, how the laws are, what kind of governance there is, what kind of norms around these four access, availability, dialogicality, and privacy. How does the public sector in that country support these rights? How are they realized by the media and ICT market and sector? And how do citizens themselves create and perpetuate these rights in real life? And this is how we see all of this. So we see that these four rights are not necessarily human rights in a classical sense, but they are essential, basic rights in the sense that without them, there is no realization of human rights. Of course, we need, let's say, freedom of expression to be dialogical. We need that, obviously. But at the same time, all of these rights really contribute to freedom of expression. If freedom of expression is not dialogical and open, is it really freedom of expression? Then it's maybe freedom of silent participation. And then, of course, these four are also interconnected. So if I feel that my privacy isn't protected in certain kind of dialogical conversations, am I willing to participate in dialogues that have, for instance, are political in nature, and so on and so forth? I also have, of course, have access to tools to participate, and there needs to be availability of content and information so I can really participate in a dialogue in an informed manner. I hope this little framework gave you an idea. And to finalize my presentation about this framework, I just want to highlight what would this mean if we would look at dialogical rights. Since I took dialogical rights, since that seems to be often the lesser understood form of these rights. So you can think about legal baseline. Constitution often includes freedom of expression and democratic participation and different opportunities. I just took this about Finland, Act on Public Service Broadcasting, for instance, and how that's supposed to engage citizens to participate. Recently, Finland has an act on libraries that is saying libraries have to be a part of sort of democratic debates and offer citizens spaces for that. obviously not happening physically in the time of Corona. Then the public sector, so direct dialogues between citizens and the government. Obviously, we're not meeting in town halls. We could say different kinds of public engagement programs. And then digital era has brought about all kinds of e-participation, electronic participation, or e-governance, e-government programs. So that could be one way to look at it. What is the public sector doing that there is dialogue between them? Then dialogues with and via institutional legacy media. Many of us probably are keenly following some of this daily. So very often legacy media news stories create this kind of dialogue, whether it's comment pages or whether it's inviting questions. Sometimes it's even citizen journalism inviting content. And often this is called interactivity, really. And then, of course, dialogue between citizens, user-generated content, and peer-to-peer communication. And for instance, this we can measure or study how much is participation related to, let's say, political or common shared issues, how much is about entertainment and family and private life, or following brands or whatnot. But of course, when we look at this framework or any other framework, this is our main challenge. The tension between transnational developments and national policies. There are no transnational policies as of yet. But why I claim that this model that I just presented could be useful is that we are starting to see nation states trying to regulate these big digital intermediaries. Shout out to India, already blocking, earlier on blocking Facebook free basics and other zero-rated services. That is already sort of clearly one state, nation state taking a stand. Recently, we've seen especially debates in Australia where Australia wants to tax social media, Facebook included, if they publish news stories. And then this most famously, Facebook says it's leaving Europe because Europe wants to prohibit Facebook transferring European data to the US. So meaning data of and by the Europeans it collects. We shall see if Facebook would really leave, but these are, we are definitely seeing this sort of nation state starting to stand up because there is no UN stepping to the plate right now. I hope this guest lecture gave you an overview of what communication rights mean in today's context. Well, where does it come from? What does it mean? Many meanings, elusive, but how essential it really is today. I've included a text, as I said, about the sort of history of communication rights in the UN context, as well as Zubov's chapter in the book about surveillance capitalism, as she calls it, and a podcast where scholars from different parts of the world talk about the different contexts of communication rights in their countries. That podcast was recorded about a year ago in Finland. And then I would like you to answer these questions in the blog comments. Is the concept of communication rights feasible at all, or should we just abandon it? Does it, is this too chaotic, too complicated? Should we just abandon it, or is it so important that we should just deal with the complexity and run with this concept as scholars, activists, advocates? If we assume that it is a concept, what should be included in communication rights? So I would like you to criticize our model also a little bit. What did we exclude from our model? Are these rights, these communication rights, universal or relative? And then the $1 million question: who should monitor and implement these rights? Please know that your participation will be entirely secured as private, and you can answer with any screen name you like. You can follow the instructions below, and I hope you will enjoy this assignment. So, thank you again for your attention. It's been a pleasure, or as we see in Finland, kiitos, and our second official language, Swedish, tack.